At the heart of anybody's spiritual journey is the question, who am I? Although I myself increasingly tend to call it, what am I? But if one is interested in this question, it clearly opens one's to the whole mystery of one's own being. Why in this vast universe with trillions of galaxies and pervaded by conscious, subtle energies, why should I be created just for a few decades? So this question, and more one realizes, begins to search what one is with all one's pretensions, but also occasionally a wish for searching for the truth. The whole area enlarges more and more, and the mystery actually deepens. It is not solved. Because in a way the suggestion is from all the traditions, that each human being is like a representative of the whole cosmos, and the whole external cosmos is mirrored inside us. Therefore, it is endless search. And of course, whenever one discovers the more demonic tendencies in one, which really basically means these tendencies which we would regard as negative, not acceptable, not good, we will criticize others for having them. But as one begins to impartially look at oneself, one would find all of those tendencies also in oneself, usually driven by self-assertion of one form or the other, which may be acquiring more prestige, more money, more pleasure, one way or the other. And then the opposite of that, the fear that it may all be lost, I may lose, I may be disregarded, I may be killed, etc. So this search always leads to more and more depth in trying to see that the whole universe is in fact mirrored inside us. And then the call is very simply expressed by a Hasidic saying, there is no room in him for God who is full of himself. Very simple statement. There is no room in him for God who is full of himself. So how to empty myself of myself? That is really, in a way, the call. And these kind of expressions, obviously, you can find in varieties of ways, sometimes very stridently, as if you have to get rid of yourself, you have to die to yourself, very strong expressions like this. But sometimes, slightly mildly, how can my usual, ordinary, egotistic self can actually become a proper instrument of the divine self in me? I already gave you this example yesterday, for example, the remark or the picture that I showed St. George killing the dragon, which is really his own face. This was from Mount Athos. I showed a picture yesterday. And so there it takes the strong expression like getting rid of this self or killing it. On the other hand, in general, the suggestion very much is that the very purpose why this body has been taken on by this particle of the spirit is that it is meant to be an instrument to assist the evolution of this particle of the spirit. And therefore, it is rather silly to get rid of the instrument. The instrument needs to be sharpened, it needs to be preserved, it needs to be taken care of. But is it actually becoming the instrument? That's the question. Or whether it just has its own idée fixe. It's just, I think I quoted Plotinus, one of my favorite Greek philosophers, that our soul, which is what has taken on the body, is amphibious in nature. It can sink completely into matter, or it can soar into the one. So this is where the struggle is. The whole of the struggle for a human being, from a spiritual perspective, really is, how can my usual, ordinary, egotistic self, sometimes, as I said, it gets expressed as if it is the enemy of my other self, and therefore needs to be gotten rid of. And so one wants to go to the monastery or go to the Himalayas, have nothing to do with the world. Those attitudes are very strong in every teaching. But in general, I don't think this is really the area to be. We also need to take care of the planet. We also need to undertake responsibilities here. And that obviously requires the body-mind to be actively engaged here. And I repeatedly say this, largely really coming from my own teacher, Jean de Salzman. These are not her words. Her words were really that ego is a good servant but a bad master. My increasing understanding is that we have both earth and heaven as our parents. Both of them need to be honored. And one doesn't need to just get rid of the earth or the planetary part and just want to go to heaven. And in this connection, constant reminder, actually much more reminder in every canonical gospel by Christ. Even also in the letter of Romans, the prophet Isaiah also says this, you have eyes but you do not see. You have ears but you do not hear. Clearly, they are speaking about subtler eyes or spiritual eyes, which need to be cultivated. And again, a reminder from a remark of St. Paul, eyes of the flesh see the things of the flesh, eyes of the spirit, the things of the spirit. And what I think something is not clearly and obviously understood, that however advanced our telescopes or microscopes may be, or any other scientific instruments, they still are eyes of the flesh. Which is why I sometimes, especially my slightly more scientifically oriented friends, are often questioning me. Oh, the astronauts went into outer space, they did not see any angels, then why the hell should we believe in angels? So should we just dismiss what Christ saw? Should we just dismiss what William Blake saw? Just because these astronauts don't see, do they have the eyes of the Spirit? In fact, I here give you a very simple incident of just on one occasion, just walking with Krishnaji. We call Krishnamurti, I should say here. Krishnaji people may not realize this. And a little accumulation of little water, almost like a little pond. And he stood there. He says, do you see how they dance? I haven't the foggiest idea what he's seeing. I am obviously not able to see something that he's seeing. And then he even spoke about how they sing. He's hearing something, he's seeing something that I am absolutely unable to see. Now, should I just say he's crazy? You see the attitude that one has developed, that we should rely on our eyes of the flesh, and if I don't see it, those things don't exist. I think one of the requirements from a spiritual point of view is to realize more and more that we know very little about the cosmos. I often remind my friends, everything that we now teach in physics was unknown 135 years ago. So give some credit to the physicists. In the next 135 years, they will discover something, or 1350 years, they will discover something. And in this context, it might actually amuse you or shock you, or whatever way you approach it, a historical event, which is in either 95 or 97, something close to that. The president of the British Scientific Society was just retiring. Thomson was his name. We don't need to worry about the name. And in his presidential address, he first of all gave a great deal of appreciation and praise for all the remarkable things that the physicists had discovered in the 19th century. And it is true. That's when electromagnetism was discovered, and that light is also an electromagnetic wave. So many things were discovered. Then he says, but I have only one regret left, that the future physicists have nothing left to discover. This is the president of the British Scientific Society's presidential address at his retirement. There is always this impression conveyed that now we know previous generations were just primitive. This attitude is very strong. So anything that HPB might say about the previous worlds even, or any other great teachers might say, oh, that's just imagination. That's not true. Because now we know. They did not know. And I sometimes remind people, one of the tribes in Mali, often I'm just forgetting the name of the tribe, I even visited the places there, Mali in Africa. They have been placing their religious rituals on the star Sirius for the last thousands of years. And that star Sirius was not discovered by our astrophysicists until hardly about 40 years ago or 50 years ago.
The Dogen tribe. The Dogen tribe.
That's right. Yeah. Now, so I think one needs to be a little careful about, just as if now we know everything, that the previous people were just all primitives. Very strong tendency. And so therefore really one might say that the purpose of spiritual practice is to develop the appropriate instrument, to develop the appropriate eyes, to be able to see what the sages see. And always the call from them really is that the search is deep within ourselves. Although strong tendency in every tradition, slightly more emphasized in the Abrahamic tradition, but very much in the Indian tradition as well, all kinds of images outside, etc., that one is worshipping. But from the spiritual search point of view, the call is to be searching within. And here is, for example, a remark of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Those who have the eyes of sacred knowledge perceive him, he's referring to God. The yogis who strive see him dwelling in themselves. But the ignorant whose self is unperfected do not see him, even if they strive to do so. I will read 2 or 3 other remarks, all related with this idea. This is a remark of Rumi now, I'm reading. You wander from room to room, hunting for the diamond necklace that is already around your neck. Rumi always has a very nice way of saying things, really. And Shiva Samhita is a very sacred text in India. He who, leaving the Shiva who is inside, worships that which is outside, that is, worships external forms, is like one who throws away the sweet meat in his hand and wanders away in search of food. Always a repeated reminder that the search is deep within ourselves. And then more and more recognition that it's not somebody else standing in my way, although it's always easy to blame somebody else, but that I am myself. In a way, sometimes it is strongly expressed that I am my own enemy, or but that I am really myself the one standing in my way, or part of myself, if you like. We could now call it my ego self or my selfish self. That's the one that stands in the way. And therefore, again, sometimes it is expressed as if one just needs to be kind to this ego self and include it to assist. But sometimes, as I just showed from the St. George killing the dragon, it's expressed much more strongly, as if one just needs to get rid of it. Don't get so attached, because it depends in a particular context. If a teacher is saying something, some students maybe do need to have a more strident manner of conversation, and some needs to be spoken much more softly. So we should not get so attached to these kind of remarks. Sometimes they are very strongly expressed, as I just gave you the examples of this. But the call really overall is that what is required is for me to practice awakening my usually sleeping, or sleeping from the perspective of the spiritual learning, my usually sleeping self, how to awaken it. That is putting it personally slightly more mildly, rather than how to kill it, how to get rid of it. And that, but again and again, the call is that what needs to be done is for this ego self to learn how it can submit or surrender to the divine self. That itself requires an enormous amount of preparation, which is why repeatedly I have been saying that it is not a question of just deciding that, okay, I will get rid of this self, because I think I already quoted to you from Einstein, but let me make a more general remark here, coming from all the traditions. Without God, it cannot be done, but without human beings, it will not be done. Very subtle combination is required. But is the human being just carrying on his own will, or is he able to hear something from the divine will? This notion that God is searching us more than we are searching him is much more clearly and strongly expressed in the Bhagavad Gita and in the Quran. Not so much in some of the other scriptures, but very strong suggestion there that if one takes even one step towards God, God will take 10 steps towards you. And this is from the Quran. But in the Bhagavad Gita, as you see, Arjuna is being taught to become the intermediary between the world and Krishna. Not just go to the Himalayas and meditate. That's not what Krishna is teaching him. It's very strong suggestion that Arjuna is required to be undertaking in his particular case, to be undertaking his battle with the enemies to establish the right justice in the country. But whatever form, sometimes people get rather upset, as if the Bhagavad Gita is especially recommending fighting or battle. I remind people that once a major metaphor is chosen, the whole following language has to follow it. For example, you see this in famous writings, for example, Teresa of Avila, as if this is a 7-storied mountain. Then you don't talk about boats. That would make no sense. But if on the other hand we have also images, it's like crossing a large ocean, then you don't talk about ice packs. You're talking about boats. So the whole metaphor has to correspond to the overall metaphor. So in this particular case, in the Bhagavad Gita, coming from the large text of the Mahabharata, there is a battle. So the first chapter in the Bhagavad Gita is really describing various weapons, various bugles they have to play, who are the warriors, who they have to fight, etc. But you don't see any of this after the first chapter. And in fact, I have often said to my friends, if there was a writer who was having a writer's block, which I can participate in, then they will describe, the first chapter will be describing maybe a library or sitting room with many books, etc., etc. But everything else after that will be the same, all the other chapters. Nothing will change. Rather than saying, therefore fight, Krishna would say, therefore write. That will be the only change. So, therefore, not to get so attached to this particular metaphor, but it is true that it is arising from the great battle in Mahabharata. Therefore, that's the overall metaphor is the battle. And therefore, Arjuna is, by the way, Arjuna is regarded as the greatest warrior in the Indian context. In fact, even now, the government of India has awards called the Arjuna Awards. They're mostly in the athletic circles now, rather than actually in the battle, but Arjuna Awards. And also, more and more call, in fact, a very major shift that takes place in one's journey. Maybe I should take a moment here to elaborate this. That the pilgrim or the searcher, you see, I keep calling them pilgrim, not just believers. That's important to keep in mind. And the searcher increasingly lets go of whatever his notion is of the goal or the destination, and more interest in the journey. Because the destination, standard phrases for that is, I wish to be enlightened, I wish to come to nirvana, I want to go to heaven, I want to find God. These will be the standard. But the suggestion from all the spiritual teachers is that none of this can actually be described accurately. Even the Buddha is unable to describe what nirvana is. In fact, you probably all know this little story. Often people would ask him to describe what nirvana is. And on one occasion, especially because his favorite disciple, Anand, kept saying that we don't need to worry about it, but people keep asking us, so what can we say? And so the Buddha said, it's a little bit like if a man has been hit by a poisoned arrow and his friends want to take the arrow out of him so that he can survive. But he says that I won't let the arrow be taken out until I know whether the arrow came from the south or the north or the east or the west, or whether the man who hit the arrow was tall or short or dark or white. He goes on and on. I'm just giving one or two very simple examples. He says, by the time these questions are answered, the man will surely die. Therefore, I do not teach what nirvana is. What I'm teaching is how to get to nirvana. This is the remark of the Buddha. So one needs to realize Christ is not describing what God is or what heaven is. Buddha is not describing what nirvana is. None of the Upanishads say what is moksha or mukti. These are the phrases in the Indian context, literally meaning liberation or freedom. And again and again they say neti neti, not this expression, not this, no expression is agreeable or suitable. Nevertheless, what they are trying to teach is how we can actually, what is the practice that is required to get to nirvana. That is what is more of interest to the Buddha, to teach that rather than to describe what nirvana is. And so there is always this suggestion again and again. It doesn't matter whether it's Eastern or Western teachings or Abrahamic or Indian tradition. In all of them, the shift that takes place is moving away from whatever my notion of the destination is, and more interest in the journey. And then one becomes actually even more interested that clearly in any journey, one step forward, two steps back, and one to the side. Anybody who has done any physics or written any music or written poems, everybody would agree with what I just said. Every journey is not a constant forward movement. There's always many things are confusing, disturbing. People then some say, what the hell, God doesn't exist. all that is, even Mother Teresa, for example, some of you may have read some of the letters of hers written after her death. She was even doubting if God exists, having spent all her life otherwise trying to do this. So the journey itself, in a way, becomes interesting. One then begins to see what is taking place in me and why is it coming about. And again and again, a strong suggestion that otherwise the destination is always conditioned by my mind or by my cultural background. In fact, I was rather surprised to learn that even in the near-death experiences, some of you know what I'm talking about, there are some people who may be either accidentally killed or suddenly die. Some of them, sometimes they have been declared completely dead. But sometimes after a few minutes or few hours, or even occasionally after a day or so, they come back alive. During that time, they have clearly consciousness is still there. What is interesting in the descriptions in this, now by this time, thousands of such cases have been reported actually in the literature. But those who come from the Christian background encounter people, they might encounter even Christ in their understanding, or they might encounter Christian sages. But people who come from the Buddhist background encounter the Buddha or the Buddhist sages. You see how conditioned we are by our background, that even after death, that is what we encounter. So this is very important to understand, that each one of God or truth is not Christian or Hindu, but we are. We are conditioned by this so much that one needs to realize that this conditioning very much sort of somehow tries to capture the ultimate reality in its own terminology very strongly. And therefore, more and more wish to be a little free of this. Here is a remark of Meister Eckhart, one of my favorite great mystic in the Christian tradition. If there were a God of whom I had any idea, it will not be worth having him as God. I pray to God to free me of God. This is Meister Eckhart. No, so we need to understand that what is behind that. Particularly, this, you can see this very strongly in the scientific realm. Whatever the mind encounters, it wishes to control it or to predict it. I give you even an example of this from the Bhagavad Gita. When Krishna shows his great form to Arjuna, when we say great form, in the Indian context, greater forms always have more arms and more eyes. Unlike in the Christian tradition or Judeo-Christian tradition, it will be more wings. The angels will have more wings. But in any case, so the Krishna is showing his great form. And you see what is Arjuna's response. Already, first of all, this is in the 11th chapter. So Arjuna has been considerably transformed, so he's able to see. But his response is, although my heart is glad, but my mind is afraid. Is in fact the first avenue to truth, first avenue to any kind of great vision. But the mind is afraid. And then he asks Krishna, please return to your usual four-armed form, which is rather curious, because until that time there is no description in the Bhagavad Gita that he has anything other than two arms. But the reason I am pointing this out is one needs to understand that any serious experience can be disturbing, even destroying. One has to be prepared not only to understand something, but also to withstand something. You can see many examples of this, especially used to be reported in the 1980s when many people, young people, were taking LSD. It is true that this has been reported by many quite intelligent people like Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts, and many others, that sometimes with LSD, etc., you can see something subtler than what we usually see. So some of them would have a vision they could fly, so they would jump out of the window, die. They're not prepared for this. You see, so this important point I'm trying to make is that for any serious experience, we need not only to be prepared to understand it, but to withstand it. Arjuna is able to withstand up to 4 arms of Krishna, but not more. Therefore, he requests, would you please come back to your usual 4-armed form? My heart is glad, but my mind is afraid. This is in the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. And I was rather struck by Pamela Travers. Some of you know, she's the author of the Mary Poppins book. In one of the articles, she makes this remark that what we call understanding is actually overstanding. We wish to control it, to predict it, want to stand over it. We're not standing under something. This is her remark, overstanding. I knew her actually quite well. On one occasion, she especially wanted me to bring some Indian mythological stories for her. And then she said she would like to have my kids were at that time about, let me see, it was in 1978, so my daughter would have been about 7 years old, and my son about 5. She said she would like to spend a day with them, but she insisted that my wife and I had to leave them. She didn't want us to be there. So my kids still remember this. They can't really recall very much exactly what she said or not, because they were quite young. But they have such a strong memory of having been with her for a whole day with the author of Mary Poppins. They of course, they did not know that she's the author of Mary Poppins or anything like this. It's only later on when I'm telling them this. But this remark of hers is rather interesting, that what we call understanding is really, in fact, overstanding. And actually in my book on the science and the sacred, I in fact quote there several scientists actually saying exactly this. If we do not actually understand something unless we can control it or predict it. This is a very strong tendency that is what is understood by understanding. So whatever mind encounters, it wants to control. And therefore, constant reminder again and again from the sages that one needs to be a little free of this controlling mind. One needs to quieten this mind. Therefore, the call to be able to submit to reality, to surrender to it, it can initially sound to many people as, we don't know what God is, why should I submit to this? That doesn't make any sense. You know, that kind of attitude comes. But and there is also this thing I have tried to say several times, because it is not so commonly said in the Abrahamic traditions, but here, since most of you come from that background, I need to keep repeating it, that even in the Abrahamic tradition, in the words of Christ himself, and also some words of St. Paul, the call actually is for each one of us to become brothers and sisters of Christ, namely, children of God ourselves. That is the call. And of course, these things become non-canonical in many ways, and here is a remark of non-canonical Gospel of Philip. Christ came not to make us Christians, but to make us Christ. Similarly, the Buddha would happily said actually, look within, you are the Buddha. In the Indian tradition, it is much more frequently expressed, but it is at the heart of all the sages within the Judeo-Christian tradition as well. This is the remark I'm trying to make for you. And again, also I have tried to say earlier here that doesn't mean that we need to be against faith or belief it can actually assist our search, but only if we actually try to put into some practice what is being taught. For example, if Christ says, love your enemies, see the difficulty of actually carrying this out. It's very nice to quote this. How many Christians in their life have been able to actually love their enemies? One of my early mentors, Mrs. Welch, who I regard as more or less as my spiritual mother, I don't know whether she made up this story or whether she read it somewhere in some other place, but this is a story she used to say, that because Christ actually does say, if somebody hits you on your one cheek, turn the other cheek to them. And that somebody wanted to test him if he really follows this. So somebody comes and slaps Christ. So Christ turns his cheek, but then when this person is going away, then Christ slaps him to see if he turns his cheek or not. I don't actually know whether this story is there in the Christian tradition, but maybe Mrs. Welch made it up. But she wanted to convey that it is easy to imagine we can test somebody else, but are we also willing to be tested? So Christ undertakes that test for this character. But in general, at least my impression is, most people, just like myself, we are happy to speak about the necessity of transformation as long as we don't have to change anything. But look at yourself impartially. That doesn't mean that one needs to be even against speaking about transformation. Maybe gradually these words begin to make some impact on one, and one may be willing more and more to actually undertake any practices of transformation. But in general, at least in my own experience and people that I encounter, it is much easier to speak about all this than to actually practice it. Which is why a remark of Shankara, one of the great philosophers in India, is actually in his very famous book. He says, disease is not cured by saying medicine, medicine, medicine. You need to take the medicine to cure the disease. So, he continues, just to say Brahma, Brahma, Brahma is not what is going to bring you to Brahma. You need to practice to relate with Brahma. This is Shankara. Disease is not cured by just saying medicine, medicine, medicine. And which is why, again and again, reminder, for example, Rumi, in one of his notes, says, and you, when will you begin that long journey into yourself? See, it's a long journey into oneself. That's the journey. And easy to say all this. It's more or less what I've been saying for the last 10 occasions here. But what is strongly recommended again and again by contemporary teachers like Krishnamurti or Guruji, by all the ancient sages like the Buddha or Christ. Let me use two Sanskrit words because that's one of them is used in the Bhagavad Gita. The other one I made up, but saying that since Krishna is a friend of mine, he would agree that he should have used it, but he didn't use it in the Bhagavad Gita. But one that is used very frequently in the Bhagavad Gita is Nashkarmaya, which literally means freedom from action. But it is not inaction. In fact, he even explicitly himself says that Nashkarmaya does not mean inaction, because without action one cannot even survive. But Nashkarmaya is really a call to be free of action being driven by my own initiative or my own aggrandizement or my own success or failure. Can an action be done through me or even by me or in me, but following the will of Krishna. And this is Nashkarmya. Not my action, but Krishna's action being done through this instrument, Ravi. And we have very classical expressions of this, actually more striking the remarks of Christ, actually, than almost anywhere else. I am not the author of the words I say. I say what my Father in heaven tells me to say. So he's not even making up his own words, his own sentences. And similarly, Arjuna is now required to carry out the will of Krishna, not to fight for his own achieving a kingdom, but what is the will of Krishna in this case? Not that retire to the Himalayas and meditate, but to struggle for the justice in the world and to establish that justice. And again and again, the suggestion that this is another remark in the Bhagavad Gita, and skillful yogi sees that I do nothing at all. And I had quoted earlier from one Chinese classic, a sage does nothing, but nothing is left undone. Now, when we say does nothing, that doesn't, one need not taking it so completely literal-mindedly. Surely his body is moving, his hands are doing something, all that is true. But it's not being initiated by his desire, by his achievement, becoming more and more clearly an instrument of Krishna's will. Similarly now, the word Nash Jnana, which is really in a way freedom from knowledge. Nobody is recommending ignorance. You see, this is always the difficulty. The trouble is when one ever says speaking freedom from action as if it is inaction, freedom from knowledge as if it is ignorance. No, nobody is recommending ignorance. I had yesterday quoted something from Socrates, but Krishna very strongly suggests, or maybe even much before Krishna actually, in the oldest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, those who are addicted to ignorance are in a great darkness, but those who are addicted to their knowledge are in a greater darkness. And these very words are repeated in a later Upanishad, the Ishavasya Upanishad. And so the very strong call, we know many things, but one can see these tendencies. I know several friends of mine from Canada who have gone to India or sometimes to Thailand, but there they want to eat the same kind of food at McDonald's as they eat here. And they want to live in a similar kind of room in a hotel, similar kind of bedding. Now, then why bother to go to another culture? So, but this tendency is very strong to be so addicted to one's habits or one's attitudes that that is the only thing which will make you comfortable, nothing else. So to be free from that is really partly the same kind of thing as being free from my knowledge. It's like being free from my habits or whatever I habitually subscribe to. And since I had mentioned Socrates or quoted something from Socrates yesterday, since I do not know, therefore I am free, was his remark. He is hardly ignorant, but not knowing means that one is able to or willing to face whatever comes. That is the kind of strength or freedom that is required, that one is able to and willing to whatever comes. And therefore not wishing to encounter only what one already knows or what one can overcome already. Okay, let me continue with another remark of, I Actually, I seem to have skipped that here. I had one other remark of Meister Eckhart here. Let me take a moment here. Yes, here is. Had I a God whom I could understand, I would no longer hold him for God. He who seeks God under settled forms lays hold of the form while missing the good concealed in it. Any image of God that we have, that is a form that we already have this in our mind. But everywhere, you can certainly see the example of image of God in the Vatican, in the very room where the popes are chosen, Michelangelo's painting. Similarly, of course, in India, many images of Krishna or Rama, particularly Krishna and Shiva, in my judgment, are the two major characters in Indian mythology. And most of the dances in India would be based on one or the other of these two characters. Although the more popular god in India is Ganesha, nice big fat belly, eating some laddus. But people often forget that he's sitting on a rat, which is meant to be the analytical mind. He's actually above that. And there is actually a story which might interest you about Ganesha especially. Shiva is said to have two sons, Kartikeya and Ganesha. Kartikeya is very strong, and he is often shown as riding, unlike Ganesha, who is sitting on the rat or a mouse. Kartikeya is often shown on a peacock running around. So in one case, Shiva is trying to find out who is more wise among the two of them, and suggests to them, whosoever can go around the world faster than the other can be the chosen one. So Kartikeya, of course, rides on his peacock and tries to go around the world. Ganesha just stands there. After a little while, he just goes around Shiva. After all, if Shiva doesn't contain the whole world. So I can tell you this example of Ganesha. Okay, let me continue with my... Then, a couple of things which one needs to speak about spiritual mysteries, which are different from scientific mysteries, because both of those operations or projects actually begin from a sense of realizing something is unknown, something is mysterious. Scientific mysteries, in principle, can actually be solved. It is true that sometimes a project is framed in a way, in a language, or that we don't have enough technical equipment or technological development to be able to test this. So sometimes one can take on a question in a scientific world, scientific research, and end up wasting a lot of time and not come to anything. In fact, this is how personally I became close friend of a very well-known physicist, John Archibald Wheeler. Some of you may know his name. Several of his students got Nobel Prize. Richard Feynman, for example, was one of his students. And he and two other people had written a book on gravitation. I was at that time, ironically, in the philosophy department at Princeton. But because of my physics background, I would often just go and sit in a physics course. And they had just written this book, but was not published yet. And they wanted to have all the graduate students who were taking this course. I was just sitting there merely auditing it. They wanted them to find out if there was any questions framed which could not actually be solved, because then a person ends up, a PhD student would end up wasting a lot of their time and will have to just waste so much time and energy if the problem can't really be solved. So John Wheeler wanted students to point out if there were any such questions at the end of different chapters. There were questions. Now you can imagine graduate students were not very eager to point out the professor is wrong somewhere. But I wasn't a student at that time. I had a postdoctoral fellowship. Actually, I was in the philosophy department, not even in physics. So I pointed out 2 or 3 of these remarks of his. And so he said, you can have 1 hour of my time anytime. And this was the first time when I pointed out some of these. Because, as you know, in the scientific project, one of the features which is completely different from spiritual project is that for anybody to get a Nobel Prize or to get even a PhD, you need to find something new. If that has already been, in fact, I remember some of our physics professors used to say, oh my God, I hope the next week Physics Review doesn't publish this, because that would mean my graduate student would have to spend 2 more years trying to figure it out, to do something else. Because if something is already published, you can't then get a PhD based on that. PhD or Nobel Prize requires that you have done something new. In the spiritual tradition, this is hardly the point. This is completely irrelevant. We could say that the Buddha published his 4 Noble Truths 2,500 years ago. That doesn't mean that I still don't need to wrestle with them to find their reality within myself. Nobody is asking us to come up with something new that Christ didn't find or the Buddha didn't find. So it's entirely a different project. This is one thing that one needs to keep in mind. And secondly, which is related with this, scientific projects are public. Spiritual project always remains individual. That doesn't mean that one can't learn anything from somebody else, or there is no public gatherings of serious individuals. In fact, that is required. Sangha in the Buddhist tradition means community. Community of searchers is a helpful, very helpful thing to have. So that nobody is suggesting that the other people are irrelevant, but the point is that it still remains my own unique individual search. And in the scientific world, it is actually public. If Newton, or let's say even closer to us, if Einstein published something, it is silly for me to spend time now trying to produce the same thing. But Christ may have, the Buddha may have said something or published something. One still needs to struggle with it and to see if it can be my own. So one needs to be very clear that scientific mysteries and spiritual mysteries have many fundamental differences. And the whole project in scientific research is to find more and more knowledge. In spiritual search, nobody is against knowledge, but there the whole purpose is to find closer and closer to the quality of being, coming close to God. Not having more knowledge of God, but having a being closer and closer to God. Some knowledge can help, but some knowledge actually hinders, which is the reason why so much emphasis on not getting so attached to your knowledge. Because one then wishes to just repeat something or carry on with this. So it's important to realize some very fundamental differences. But then, as I just finished saying, that spiritual mysteries, even in principle, cannot be solved. By what I mean by that is, there cannot be a mental description of this, what it is that one has found, what is nirvana, or what is God, etc. And that now you know what it is, so you don't need to worry about it. No. Spiritual mysteries, even in principle, cannot be solved. But depending on the person and their search, often in quiet moments, they are dissolved. Which is to say that one does not deny the mystery, one is not afraid of the mystery, one actually celebrates the mystery. Bach would celebrate it by writing music, Uday Shankar by dancing, Newton by doing physics, Eliot by writing poetry. Each person celebrates the mystery according to their own ability, their own capability. But the mystery is dissolved, but it is not solved. Whereas scientific mysteries have a whole different purpose, different enterprise, different solution. One needs to keep this in mind. So I will, I think, now stop for a few moments and we have a break. But bring your own insights and questions. And maybe I should have just quoted the remark of Newton here, partly to indicate that for some great scientists, science itself has been a spiritual path. I actually have an article on this in my book on Science and the Sacred. For example, this is the remark of Newton. Whatever the future generations might say, as far as I am concerned, I am like a little child sitting at the ocean, at the beach of the ocean, finding one pebble or another of truth, while the whole ocean of truth lies undiscovered before me. This is Newton. Similar remark in more contemporary language by Einstein. In fact, Einstein actually very much makes this remark that anybody who really sees something true about the universe will immediately realize the enormous intelligence behind it, which none of our capabilities can possibly come anywhere close to it. This is Einstein's remark. You see many such remarks you can find, as I said. But keep in mind, these are not written in scientific books, in scientific papers, which is why I made this remark yesterday. What scientists say is not what science says. Because from a scientific point of view, if you were writing in a scientific paper, to say anything about God is totally silly. Then you have, how do you verify this for or against? It doesn't matter. Whatever you want to say. Because from a scientific point of view, you ought to be able to measure something about it or describe it. It is, but any scientist can be touched by there is something, divine spirit or not, so they can say something about it. I can guarantee, if you can ever show me most of the remarks which are quoted from any of these scientists, you can never find them in a scientific book or a scientific paper. I'll be happy to be proven wrong about this if you can show me sometime. Ryan, do you wish to say something? You're raising your hand.
Yeah, hi, Professor. It's an honor speaking with you. I really...
Please unmute yourself.
No, it's okay.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Professor. It's an honor speaking with you. I was just wondering your perspective on But just I know we don't know much about the afterlife and the cosmos and heaven and stuff like you said, but I was wondering just what your perspective was. My brother is 28 years old. He passed away 2 years ago, and it's really had an impact on our family, my mom. And I was just wondering your perspective if you thought maybe afterlife, I might see him again before possible reincarnation or whatever might happen, in the afterlife. I was wondering what your perspective on that might be.
Well, first of all, I should say that I'm not personally really very aware of what takes place after death, but I can more or less convey what generally is said in the traditions. But particularly in the Oriental tradition, very strong emphasis that, or in the Theosophical Society literature also, that the particle of divinity, which often we call it soul, itself takes place in different qualities of materiality. Our usual body, but then our subtler bodies, and the subtler body does not die at the same time as the ordinary material body dies. And then this is the one general kind of, I'm making just some general remarks, and that after the death of the usual body, the spiritual element still continues, and then depending on the quality of the person's actions or desires, would take another birth, another incarnation, which will correspond to the quality, if you like, the result of what. This is a very common idea in all teachings, that what we do before we die has a consequence in our life after we die. But they both agree that the life continues. In the Abrahamic tradition, especially for the last nearly 1400 years now, there is not very much an idea of reincarnation. So the suggestion is that the person is judged. Even there are variations, immediately judged or partially immediately judged and would be judged later on, more or less at the end of times. And then they could be permanently in heaven or permanently in hell, depending on the quality of their actions before they died. But in the Oriental traditions, very strong emphasis on reincarnation, which of course is certainly the quality of life I would have in the next life, is based on what I deserve based on my activities in this life. But there is no suggestion that this particle of divinity or soul that has taken on the body dies.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Before you talked about people that had near-death experiences, and they would, like, if you were Christian, you'd see Jesus. If you were Buddhist, you'd see Buddha, etc. I don't mean this to be funny, but is there any evidence of people that had no background that they came from, whether they were atheists or just were not brought up in any religious tradition? What would they see?
I don't actually have any specific data, but one remark I'd like to make, which is relevant to what you raised. One may declare oneself to be an atheist or that I don't have any religious background, but we are still very much conditioned by the cultural, social background. In fact, I had quoted at one time a very well-known scholar, Northrop Frye is his name, passed away a few decades ago. He wrote a book called, I think it's called The Great Code, in which he writes very clearly about how whole of European literature, even, he's more literature-oriented, is very much influenced by the Bible. So even if a person could say, I'm an atheist or agnostic or whatever, if they have read any poetry, any book, it is likely to be influenced by the Bible if they are growing up here. If they're growing up in India, it is likely to be influenced by something in the Upanishads or in the Bhagavad Gita, similarly in any other country. So I think those influences are actually very strong. Very ordinary example. My kids growing up in Canada, and we have holidays at Easter and at Christmas, and they have all kinds of hymns being sung at that time. Every school tries to have little plays, etc., etc. So it doesn't matter what background they come from. Later on, they may declare themselves as Buddhists or as just atheists or agnostics or whatever. Doesn't matter. But they hold their training, all their childhood memories are invaded by, if you like, if you take it negatively, or pervaded by the Christian background. So, in a way, I suppose it is possible that a person can try very hard to deny all this, which is the reason I often suggest as an exercise, you can actually try it yourself. Supposing a teenager asks you, I have heard the word God. What is God? Don't do it right now, but think about it. What would be your response to this? I would personally be completely surprised if your response does not have some input from the cultural, social background in which you grew up. Because we all have, whether we like it or not, our mind cannot think without having some images or without having some time orientation, etc. So unless you have qualified your mind or become having a completely quiet mind, then you can speak from a completely fresh insight. Otherwise, most of us, our mind is intervening, and the mind is conditioned by the language we use, and it is conditioned by all the images we encounter. This is the reason why in spiritual search there is always a call again and again to be more and more free of the mind. The ordinary mind, again, the English word mind, as I have often said, covers too much scope. Buddha mind as well as monkey mind. Nobody is against the Buddha mind, it's the monkey mind that's the trouble. So some different words are required to convey this idea, but we could just simply speak in terms of different levels of the mind. Anybody else wishes to?
Walter?
Yeah.
Walter first, and then Andrea.
Andrea, please.
No,
Yes.
Oh, Walter, yeah.
Yes. Can you understand me well enough? Okay.
Yes.
I have a question concerning the path of meditation that Patanjali offers us compared to the path of contemplation in the cloud of unknowing. Can these two be compared, or do you see basic differences?
Very interesting question. Actually, in the cloud of unknowing, first of all, the terminology. For example, the word love is so frequently used in the cloud of unknowing, and it is not used even a single time in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And so, therefore, it invokes in us a slightly different emphasis. But on the other hand, what is the overall practice? In the cloud of unknowing, the practice really is to, as it were, to set up, first of all, we may take this theoretically, that God is above the cloud of unknowing, which is to say we cannot know him, repeatedly suggested, but we can love him. Love in the sense that we can be called by him, not love in the sense that I know what God is, etc. But then very strong suggestion is to create, in that book, The Cloud of Unknowing, the strong suggestion is to create a cloud of forgetfulness or a cloud of forgetting, to place everything that I know below the cloud of forgetting, which is really partly what I was otherwise trying to convey. In the Bhagavad Gita, it will be more, or in the Upanishad, it will be like not to be attached to what I know. And because if I am attached to it, then I'm in a greater darkness, as I quoted from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So many things are actually common But it's interesting that the word love is not used in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras even once. Whereas in the Cloud of Unknowing, it's used dozens of times, repeatedly used actually, this word. So not to get so stuck with the words, but in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the suggestion again is to place everything. They don't use that word to put it below the cloud of forgetting. The word that is used in Patanjali Yoga Sutra is vairagya, which will be like non-identification. And then Patanjali very clearly speaks about two different levels of vairagya. Lower vairagya arises from, as if I'm fed up with the world. It's not leading to truth or whatever. So it arises from disenchantment. Whereas higher vairagya, which he very much admires, arises having seen the vision of the on high. If somebody has seen a vision of Purusha, in the case of using Patanjali's expression, or a vision of God, then one is not attached to anything that one sees. So that vairagya, he says, a typical example of that from the Western tradition will be John of the Cross, having actually encountered, on one occasion at least, an encounter with God in his contemplation. He's no longer satisfied with anything he now sees in the world. In Indian example, those of you who are familiar with Gita Govind, Krishna and Radha have been together, now they're separated. So that whole poem is really Radha is pining for Krishna. But that is a different kind of vairagya. It is arising from having had a union with the highest level and then separated. So Patanjali speaks about two kinds of vairagya. One arising from a lower level, if you like, because I'm disenchanted with the world, it's not leading to truth, that kind of thing. And many people actually come to this. In fact, most people initially come from that. And then they wish to contemplate something which is, from their perspective, leading to more truth, which may be that I should go to the Himalayas or go to the monastery. It could take many actions, or just give up the business I'm now doing because it's not really leading me to any great truth. So, but that would be considered lower vairagya by Patanjali. So both of them actually are speaking about placing something below the cloud of forgetfulness, but not using the same terminology.
Thank you. This helps a lot.
But I highly recommend. I am sometimes actually surprised that my Indian friends haven't really read some great Indian texts, and my Christian friends haven't read some of these absolutely classical texts in the Christian literature. But I guess they're all very busy making their livelihood or teaching to the others, like my friend here. Who was it, Andrea?
Andrea.
Yeah.
Hi, Raviji. I had a question about going back to the near-death experiences. You taught a course a couple of years ago in which you recommended a video by, I believe it was a medical doctor, and he gave a lecture because he'd done a lot of research on near-death experiences, and you gave this highly recommended. And one of the things that I gleaned from that lecture is that near-death experiences are not only at the moment of death or when someone is actively dying or has come back from dying, but also that in the 6 months before death, people will encounter people from the other side, relatives that have passed, not necessarily someone who is, associated with their religion or their tradition. And so I was wondering if you could speak about that a little bit.
Yes. That person that I was referring to is, I tend to pronounce this as Peter Fenwick, but in England they pronounce it as Peter Fenwick, but it's written as Fenwick. So to me it seems obvious that it should be Fenwick, but they pronounce it as Fenwick. So it's Peter Fenwick. And he has done a fair amount of research in this field, and actually I recommend that to people. And one of the incidents I still remember, this is in a manner of speaking, pre-death, but a couple, they were English, and the man has apparently gone to Australia. They are even separated from each other. But on one occasion, about at 5 a.m., the person who was his wife earlier, they're now separated, but they're still officially married. So the wife actually has this very strong vision that he has just called to say that I'm dying. Now he's in Australia. And then a few hours later, she actually gets a telegram or a message from somebody there that he actually died at that very moment when she's getting this message. So Peter Fenwick reports several such incidents in which a communication is apparently taking place, even just before death, but it is obviously an important event in somebody's life. So in that sense, it's a very large event. And even among people who are, in a manner of speaking, separated. But then he actually speculates that those who are very much in love, if they are temporarily separated somewhere, that they would definitely get some clarity or some intimation that the person is dying. And apparently in fact, he even himself remarks that many of such incidents, similarly about the incidents about reincarnation, etc., in general, they have been reported in Asia or Africa, but not very many times in Europe or America. And the reasoning, what he gives, which seems to make some sense to me, that because here, since reincarnation is not accepted as an acceptable idea in the culture, and therefore if a kid at some early, usually until the age of 4 or 5, they can still remember something from their previous life. But if they say something in a different language or it sounds strange, the parents think, oh, we need to take care of them. They're going to go crazy. they need to see a psychiatrist or something like this. That here, rather than possibly imagining that maybe they are really referring to something from a prior incarnation, the tendency is to regard this as something has gone wrong with them. And therefore, rather than acknowledging it, so that's, according to him, that's the reason why many few incidents are mentioned here or recognized here. In fact, this was a person who has done much more scientifically oriented research in reincarnation. His name is just escaping me. I have actually been with him in a conference in Finland together. Stevenson, that's right, thank you. Yeah, Ian Stevenson. And I actually asked him the same question, why is it that very few cases are reported? And his answer was very similar to this, that here it would be regarded as something has gone wrong. But there is another thing which we should also recognize. I may have said this earlier as well, that what we usually call normal is really what is usual. In fact, as long as a person remains normal, they cannot come to any truth, real truth. Krishnamurti is a good example of this. Christ was a good example of this. Buddha is a good example of this. People around them think they are crazy. They have gone mad. They should see a psychiatrist. Because they are super normal, but they are not normal. So the trouble is, as long as I remain normal, guaranteedly I cannot come to subtle truth. What is required is not to be subnormal, but supernormal. But what we usually call normal is just common thing. This is the way most people are. It is really referring to the usual. And any of the great sages, same thing happened with Aurobindo, same thing happened with Raman Maharishi, that their people around them or some of their friends think, oh my goodness, he's having a psychiatric problem. He needs to see a psychiatrist. And unfortunately, in some cases, their friends succeed and they take them to psychiatrists. And this usually ruins their whole spiritual involvement. But luckily, Krishnamurti refused to go to any psychiatrist, or people around him weren't taking him. But so therefore, they can continue to be abnormal. Otherwise, the tragedy is, if they are taken to the psychiatrist, they are made usually not made normal, but more or less they're forbidden to say anything abnormal. So one needs to be very clear about these things. The society is determined to just keep us all at the same usual level, earning and spending, eating and excreting. This is the whole purpose. That's the project of the society. That is the normal. And that can never lead you to any truth of the kind that these sages are speaking about. But to be abnormal initially is almost always understood by people to be subnormal. You've gone crazy. Same thing about people recalling any previous lives. I think, maybe I was telling it to some friends here. My own daughter, she was just slightly more than 2 years old at that time. And this was month of February, lots of snow outside. We are actually lying on the snow. This is not so unusual, but well dressed, etc. Looking at the stars. Suddenly, absolutely out of the blue, and she had started speaking clearly hardly a few months earlier. She says, "Dad, do you know what I was before I was born?" I wanted to hear her. She says, "I was a star in the sky." This is a 2-year-old kid saying this. And on one conference in England, I once mentioned this. There was a conference on rebirth. Several people there showed me some remarks of Shakespeare saying exactly this kind of things in some of his writings. Now, where is she coming from that? I have no idea. But I mentioned some of these things that if we don't dismiss it or think the person is crazy, etc. Another thing I rather strongly recommend to parents particularly, even labeling things. This actually had struck me on one occasion. Again, I was just carrying my daughter, looking at some beautiful trees with lovely, lovely flowers. Something in me wanted to say to her, "Oh, look how beautiful." But then it was clear to me, I should not use any of this phraseology to impose these words on her. Let her just look. That will allow her to just see without labeling certain words. The moment the words get labeled, next time, the words take over. That's the tragedy. One doesn't see. Immediately, "Oh, that's a beautiful flower." That's the end. See it yourself clearly. So one needs to actually let things take place rather than imposing a terminology on it or a word on it. So, thank you. If you have other questions or comments, please speak. It will be very helpful. Yeah.
Maria
Oh.
I have one too. Maria.
Right.
There have been a number of hands that went up all at once.
Oh.
This isn't referring to what you said earlier this morning about the path, one step forward, 2 steps back, something like that. What you just said about the words taking over struck me as relevant because when I heard that, you went on speaking, but my mind went to, first of all, to my breathing, and I thought, well, my breath goes on continuously. It does not go. And then I had the image of the waves on an ocean. They're not going back and forth. They're going right in. And then right in the middle of those two images came the sense of the ocean as a whole and breath as a whole, of all beings breathing at once, or being breathed, as you like to say. And it's interesting how when you let the words go, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, something else takes their place.
Yes.
If your mind is curious, which was mine at the moment. So, but I really, I enjoy the responses in my own mind to what you say, especially when you repeat things. They're, the mind reacts in a different way. It's in the same space at the same time, and anyway, that was interesting. And also relating to the death experience, I was alone with my mother at her passing, and as she left her body, I had a little notebook, and I was journaling to focus my mind. And I asked her, where are you? And I got the response, there's just darkness. And I said, well, look for the light. And in my mind, totally clear, came these words, we have been this way together for many times. Don't worry. And I felt that a similar thing happened when I was alone with my husband when he passed. And as he passed, I had a clear image of his mother. And I felt something similar. She brought him in, I'm midwifing him out. And his life I saw punctuated by two strong women. I think these little things, if we're attentive to what life brings us, surprises come. And that is a delight.
Yeah, thank you for saying this. Also, really, there is a lot more data now being gathered about. It probably doesn't happen in every case, but in some cases, just as a person is about to die, even if they are actually unable to sit up, etc., suddenly they sit up as if they are reaching to hold somebody's hand. And in some places, they have reported literally streaks of light coming into the room. They can't understand from where this light is coming. So there seem to be more and more cases that are being reported now, and it becomes difficult to completely dismiss that something non-dramatic takes place at the time of a person dying. I don't personally have much experience of this. Only in one particular case, I was there when a person died. But I think if those who are there or close to their relatives, almost bound to experience some what we would call strange experience, but strange only because we don't usually expect them, so they are strange. But maybe they are more common than we realize. But a lot of data is actually now being gathered about precisely this kind of thing. Yes.
Along these lines, Maria, today and actually 2 weeks ago, the first week, about that sometimes we're change at the molecular level when some words, some phrases, something that touches us deeply. And then you mentioned also very similar to, she had this kind of come through beautiful imagery of the molecules, like totally maybe a shifting of consciousness, I'm thinking. And then you mentioned your dialogue, your conversation with Krishnamurti here in Ojai about the same thing when things just came through you and you had to say them. Although he mentioned he didn't want to have a serious conversation.
No, he was not objecting to it, so he still wanted us to have a serious conversation.
But can you talk a little bit more about that and what you told him? I keep contemplating going back over and over because I have like the Cloud of Unknowing, that's book. I keep going back to that because it really deeply touched me. And every time I go back, there's something else, so.
Now, that particular incident, actually, I had mentioned in my talk when I gave at the Krishnamurti Center. Were you there, or did you hear that?
I heard it, but I'd like to hear it again.
No, it's just maybe almost everybody here has heard this, but basically, in a summary way, I wanted to come to Ojai, wondering if Krishnamurti was here at that time. I was on my way actually from Hawaii going back to Halifax. So from Los Angeles I had called, and Mary Zimbalist, who was really, I sometimes jokingly say, who was like his nanny, sometimes taking care of him in many different ways. Maybe his secretary, but people may want to use different words. And she was very hesitant for me to come because she said he's exhausted because he's been speaking 3 or 4 talks in successive days here. And of course, Krishnamurti always spoke with a great passion and great energy. And he was at least 85 years old at that time, so not a young man. So she said, please promise you won't raise anything serious, which is what I had promised then. So that's the background. And we were sitting there at lunchtime, and also quite oddly from my point of view, maybe he wasn't eating very much at that time, or at least that day. Throughout the lunch, he kept holding my right hand. I was sitting on his left side. So I had to eat with my left hand, which is completely unusual particularly in India. It's very odd. But even here, most people don't necessarily eat with their left hand. And we were, both Mary and I were trying to say something about Krishna. It's a nice sunny day. It's just some trivial kind of thing so that we don't say anything serious. This is when suddenly something came out of me without my wishing to do that. In fact, really, if I was really seriously following my pledge to Mary Zimbalist that I won't raise anything serious, I shouldn't have said that. But it was not something I decided to say, but just somehow emerged that every impression leaves a very strong, at a cellular level, an effect on the body, which I had not even specially thought about it very much. It just came from me. And he was obviously very interested in this. He said, should we go into it? And Mary Zimbalist looking at me with dragon eyes. Really, I have betrayed my promise to her. And then he sent somebody to get a tape recorder. So there we were. But then afterwards, I tried to apologize, tried to say maybe we'll speak maybe after lunch, we'll have a walk together or whatever. No, he just wanted to continue speaking about this, exchanging about it. So therefore, feeling bad myself, I left after this lunch, didn't stay there, which was my intention earlier, was to stay in Ojai. And 3 days later, the phone rings at my house. And my wife answered the phone, and she says, she had heard Krishnamurti, in fact, more frequently than I had. She had taught in a Krishnamurti school in India. She says, the voice sounds very familiar, but very formal. May I speak to Professor Ravindra? In Canada and USA, usually people don't talk like this, We don't use this kind of terminology. And it was Krishnamurti on the phone. Where he got my phone number, I have no idea. And so he said, what you had said 3 days ago, I have been thinking about it. Can you come and see me for half an hour? I'm 4,000 miles away. But that's the background. But as I said the other day, that an iron filing cannot avoid going to a magnet. I had no choice. I actually had a conference a week later in England. So I went to London from Halifax via Los Angeles.
Is there anything else that came to you or him about the subject? Any?
When I came, we spoke about many things, but really there, the main emphasis ended up being, because earlier, actually 4 or 5 years before that meeting, a journal was just starting. They wanted me to write an article on Krishnamurti. So I had written him more or less like a letter, in which I was even, this may seem strange, but I was even critical of the Buddha. I said, strikes to me, because Krishnamurti also would occasionally say to, you can get out of jobs or do this and that. So I was always concerned. I said, even the Buddha, having been becoming the king of the other world, why would he not be the king of this world? Why is there this opposition between this world and that world? To me, this has always been the big issue in India. They all just want to go to nirvana and forget about the earth. And so I had there raised this question in that letter also. And then at the end I had also said, because there is always a strong tendency, particularly people who are more scientifically oriented, that we can find the truth, we can conquer this, even if we can get to God, if that exists. But it was clear to me that that was the sentence that I can, Krishnamurti repeatedly speaks about it. This is not, no spiritual teacher would say that you can just walk into heaven with your boots on. It is something that needs to be submitted to. So I said, the letter actually ended by saying that I can understand that there is no way from here to there. But is there a way from there to here? And so I gave that letter to Krishnamurti when I came, because obviously he would not have, many people probably wrote to him. I don't actually know that. So I was sure that he would not have read this. This was written many years earlier. So, but he was quite interested in the letter. So he said, we'll speak about it next day. So in the morning, he says he was especially struck by the last sentence in that letter, which is what I just quoted. He said, this is what I've been teaching for the last 60 years. This was his remark. And so we had an exchange. He actually even prepared breakfast for me, and which I feel very blessed actually. I have met some very remarkable people who have been so generous to me, I can hardly believe. In fact, I have just now, the Theosophical Publishing House in India is going to publish something which I call Blessed by Undeserved Grace. They decided to change the title to Blessed by Mysterious Grace, because they think it can't be wholly undeserved. I think it is undeserved, but they don't believe it. And so there I try to describe some of these very experiences. But real insight, any scientist would agree with this, or any great poet would agree. Real insight comes from the other side. But something is required from our side to be able to even receive it. Which is what I earlier had mentioned in the talk, that without God it cannot be done. Without God it cannot be done, but without human beings it will not be done. Something is required from us. But nevertheless, the energy and the power comes from on high.
I woke up this morning and I have to read this to you. Okay, so speak up. I want to thank Cortona people having this place of refuge from the craziness out in the world. And I want to thank Robbie for creating a safe place to express ourselves. I am so grateful for our time together. It has given me courage to deal with what I have to do. It makes me, I don't know why I cry. It makes me stronger, healthy individual. Thank you. Thank you. One and all for showing up. So be it.
We need also, but in a way you are implying, there are very few institutions which allow something like this to be discussed. So I am always very grateful to Kratona. And also, by the way, some of you may be familiar that there is something called the School of the Wisdom in the headquarters of the Theosophical Society in India, in a place called, which is now called Chennai. Earlier it used to be called Madras. They also, at least in my case, they allow me. If you people don't mind, maybe I will tell you the whole background of that incident, actually, because it was very significant in my life. This was in 1981. At that time, the Krishnamurti Foundation used to have, occasionally they would invite about 10 or 12 people to have dialogues with Krishnamurti, and then hundreds could be around, but they were not expected to say anything or to ask anything. But they could listen, and these 10 or so people would talk with each other. And people often don't realize that Radha Barne, who was the head of international president of TS, was also a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation of India. So she was also there. And Mark, you may have been there. I don't actually now especially recall this, but since he's also a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation of India. But in any case, in that conversation, she must have been struck by something I said. I don't actually especially recall what I said. But she invited me to give a talk at the Theosophical Society, which is across the river. And there, when I was speaking, I don't even recall a specific topic, but something always to do with science and religion. People are very interested in this topic. And given my scientific background, they think I probably know something about science. So they keep inviting me to talk about it. And in the middle of my talk, there were at least 100 people there, and some of them very learned Brahmins, sitting in especially traditional Indian clothing. You've seen some of them gathering there. One of them stands up, absolutely in the middle of my talk. Sir, what you're saying is against the tradition. And I have no idea from where it came. Literally, a flame went from my head down to my toes. Radha Barne saw it, one or two other people saw it. I felt it internally. And I said, if this is against the tradition is wrong. Stunned silence. After that, Radha Barne spoke to me. She said, anytime you wish to come and speak here, please choose your time, choose your topic. Whenever you like to come, we'll be happy to welcome you to come. This is why I started teaching in the School of the Wisdom after that. But I must have taught at least 20 odd years, 20 times. That's how only twice in my life I have had that kind of experience. What causes it? Even maybe just because this guy just stands up absolutely in the middle of my sentence actually and says something. And no idea what causes this kind of thing. But it clearly has connected me with the Theosophical Society strongly, because Radha Barne just absolutely said to me immediately after that, anytime you wish to choose any topic, anything. And also as a professor, one of the things I have learned, if I wish to learn something, it is very helpful if I am obliged to teach it. Because my conscience will bother me if I am not at least 2 steps ahead of the students. So often I would like to teach a course in which I'm not qualified to teach, because it obliges me to learn. For example, my book on the Bhagavad Gita actually resulted from giving talks there, and then sometimes I repeat those talks here because it allows me to further refine something. And that book was published based on my talks at the School of the Wisdom. Similarly, my book on the Yoga Sutras. And I wanted to learn something about the Rig Veda. Every Hindu says that the whole Hindu tradition started from the Rig Veda, but I have rarely met a Hindu who has actually read the Rig Veda. It's the same thing in Christianity. People can talk about this and that. They don't really read the classical text. And so I wanted to learn something about the Rig Veda, but nobody would allow me to teach any university unless I had done a PhD or something in Rig Veda. But Radha Barne was quite happy for me to teach, which therefore allowed me to learn many things, actually. So I have been very grateful to the Theosophical Society to give me that freedom. But as I said, my conscience will really bother me if I don't stay at least 2 steps ahead of the students. So I work, as in the US, they would say, I work my ass off. It's not an expression we usually use. So I'm very grateful to the society, actually.